What you're about to see was captured by a mapping drone flying over a remote section of national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The operator was working alone, running a routine aerial survey, when the live feed showed something moving in a forest clearing 12 miles from base camp. The drone recorded multiple massive upright figures covered in dark fur, canine features moving with coordination, watching the drone from below. The files still exist, locked away on hard drives. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. There's footage sitting on a hard drive in someone's basement that was never supposed to be seen by anyone. The person who captured it doesn't want it seen, won't talk about what it shows, and has spent the last year trying to pretend it doesn't exist. The footage came from a mapping drone, one of those high-end units with professional cameras and GPS tracking. It was doing routine aerial survey work in a remote section of national forest in the Pacific Northwest. The survey was legitimate, proper permits, nothing unusual about the job itself. Just standard topographic mapping for a forestry assessment. The drone was programmed to fly a grid pattern over about 40 square miles of terrain, capturing overlapping high-resolution images that would be stitched together into detailed maps. Completely automated flight, completely routine work. Except the drone recorded something it wasn't supposed to see. Something that's been living in those forests for longer than anyone wants to admit. The operator was working alone, which is pretty normal for this kind of survey work. Mid-40s, been flying drones professionally for about 7 years. Started with real estate photography, moved into agricultural surveys, eventually specialized in forestry and land management mapping. The work is steady if you know what you're doing, and the pay is decent. Most of it is boring. Launch the drone, let the autopilot run its programmed route, monitor the feed to make sure everything's functioning properly. Bring it back when the battery gets low. You spend most of your time sitting in a truck or a tent with a laptop, watching the same endless canopy of trees scroll past on the screen. This particular job was a week-long project. The area being surveyed was deep backcountry, accessible only by logging roads that hadn't been maintained in years. The operator set up a base camp at an old clear-cut site that gave enough open space to safely launch and land the drone. The plan was straightforward. Fly systematic grid patterns during daylight hours. Download and back up the data each evening. Move on to the next section the following day. 7 days to cover the entire survey area, assuming weather cooperated and equipment functioned normally. The first 3 days went exactly as expected. Beautiful weather, clear skies, minimal wind. The drone performed flawlessly. The operator would launch it in the morning, watch it execute its programmed flight path on the monitor, bring it back to swap batteries, launch again for another run. Hours of footage showing nothing but unbroken forest canopy. Dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir and western hemlock. Occasional clearings where natural meadows opened up, streams cutting through valleys. Standard Pacific Northwest wilderness. Exactly what the survey was supposed to document. The anomaly showed up on day 4. The operator was monitoring a routine afternoon flight, the drone working its way through a section of particularly dense forest about 12 miles from base camp. The altitude was set at 400 feet above ground level, high enough to avoid any trees, but low enough to capture detailed imagery. The camera was capturing everything below in sharp detail. The operator wasn't paying close attention to the live feed. After 3 days of watching endless trees, you stop actively watching and just monitor the technical readouts to make sure the systems are operating correctly. Something on the screen caught their eye. Movement. Not the movement of wind in trees or water in a stream, but deliberate movement. Something large moving through a clearing. The operator switched to full-screen view of the camera feed, trying to get a better look. The drone was already past the clearing, showing only trees again. They checked the GPS position, marked it, then manually took control of the drone and brought it back around. Banking the drone in a wide circle, bringing it back over the clearing from a different angle. The clearing came back into view. Small opening in the forest, maybe 80 feet across, natural meadow with grass and scattered rocks. And there were things in it. Multiple large figures, dark against the lighter grass. The operator zoomed the camera in as far as it would go. The image on screen showed 4 distinct figures, large, covered in dark fur, moving on 2 legs. Not bears. Bears don't move like that, don't hold themselves upright with that kind of easy balance. These things were walking the way humans walk, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too broad through the chest and shoulders, arms that hung lower than they should. The operator held the drone in position, keeping it circling at a distance, camera locked on the clearing. The figures were clearly visible in the footage. They were doing something in the clearing, but at 400 feet in maximum zoom, the details were hard to make out. Some kind of activity, coordinated movement between them. One of the figures was significantly larger than the others, probably 8 or 9 feet tall if the trees at the clearing edge provided accurate scale. The other 3 were somewhat smaller, maybe 7 feet, moving around the larger one in patterns that suggested purpose, not random wandering. Then one of them looked up. The operator saw it clearly on the screen. The creature stopped what it was doing, tilted its head back, and looked directly at the drone. The camera captured the face for just a moment. Elongated snout, clearly canine features, but attached to a skull structure that was wrong for any wolf or dog. The other figures stopped and looked up as well. They were aware of the drone, watching it, not reacting with panic or running for cover, just watching, evaluating, trying to figure out what this thing was doing in their sky. The largest one made a gesture. The operator saw it clearly, raised one arm and pointed directly at the drone, then motioned to the others. Communication. They were talking about it, discussing what to do about this mechanical intruder. 2 of the smaller figures moved to the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the trees. The other 2 remained visible, still watching the drone. The operator realized with growing unease that these things were intelligent enough to coordinate a response. That gesture wasn't instinct. It was planning. The smart move would have been to leave. Return the drone to base camp, pack up the equipment, get out of that forest. But the operator had invested 3 days in this survey, had a contract to complete, and more importantly, had just captured something unprecedented on camera. Something that would need verification, documentation, closer examination. The rational part of their brain knew they should leave, but the part that wanted answers, that needed to understand what they were seeing, kept the drone in the air, kept the camera recording. The operator adjusted the drone's position, trying to keep visual contact with the 2 figures still in the clearing, while the camera maintained maximum zoom. The footage shows them clearly. They moved with too much coordination, too much obvious awareness for this to be any known animal. One of them bent down and picked something up from the ground. A rock, large enough that the operator could see it at this distance. The creature hefted it, testing its weight, then looked back up at the drone. The implication was clear. These things could throw, could use projectiles as weapons. The 2 creatures that had disappeared into the trees reappeared at different points around the clearing edge. They'd circled around, positioning themselves at different angles relative to the drone's position. The operator watched this happen on screen and understood immediately what it meant. These weren't animals reacting on instinct. This was tactical thinking. They were spreading out to give themselves multiple approach angles, to prevent the drone from watching all of them simultaneously. They were hunting it. One of them launched a rock. The operator saw it leave the creature's hand in a smooth overhand throw, saw it arc up toward the drone. The rock missed, falling back to the forest canopy below, but it came close enough that the drone's proximity sensors detected it as an obstacle. The automated safety systems tried to adjust position, creating a momentary camera shake that made the operator's heart rate spike. These things had just tried to knock a drone out of the sky, had come close to succeeding. The throw itself was impressive, getting a rock up to 400 feet with enough velocity to be a threat. Another rock from a different direction. This time, the operator saw it coming and manually maneuvered the drone to avoid it. The rock passed through the space where the drone had been hovering moments before. They were coordinating their throws, trying to predict where the drone would move. The operator realized they needed to get the drone out of range, but before they could increase altitude, the screen showed something that made them freeze. More movement at the clearing edge. More figures emerging from the tree line. The footage captures what the operator saw next. At least 6 more creatures stepping into the clearing from different directions. Some of them were smaller, juveniles probably, but others were as large as the first group. 10 total now, maybe more still in the trees. The operator's hands were shaking as they pulled up the drone's altitude, climbing it to 600 feet, then 800, getting it out of range of thrown rocks. The creatures below tracked its movement, heads tilting back to watch it climb. They didn't pursue or throw more stones. They just stood there, watching, making their presence known. At 800 feet, the operator held position and just recorded. The clearing below showed the creatures clearly, now that the drone was stable and higher. They'd formed a loose circle in the open space, all of them facing inward like they were having some kind of gathering. The largest one, the first that had pointed at the drone, stood in the center. Its body language suggested it was addressing the group. The others were positioned around it in a way that looked deliberate, organized. This wasn't a random cluster of animals. This was a group with structure. A community. The operator kept the drone in position for another 10 minutes, camera recording everything. The creatures below seemed to lose interest in the drone once it was out of throwing range. They went back to whatever they'd been doing before it arrived. Some of them moved around the clearing in patterns that suggested work or task completion. Others stayed still, appearing to watch or supervise. One of the smaller ones, probably a juvenile, approached the large central figure and appeared to interact with it. Teaching, learning, transfer of knowledge between generations. The camera captured details the operator wouldn't notice until reviewing the footage later that evening. One of the creatures was holding something. Not a rock or a stick picked up randomly, but an object that showed signs of deliberate shaping. The footage would reveal it was some kind of tool, edges smoothed and worked into a specific form. Another creature had what looked like a carrying pouch made from woven plant material slung across its shoulder. These weren't just intelligent beings. They were beings with material culture, with craftsmanship, with technology suited to their needs and environment. The battery warning chimed. 20% remaining, enough to get back to base camp with minimal margin for error. The operator made the decision to return, brought the drone's nose around, pointed it toward home, let the autopilot calculate the route. As the drone banked away, the camera caught one last glimpse of the clearing. The large central figure was looking up again, watching the drone leave. The operator swears they saw it raise one hand, not in threat or warning, but in what looked almost like acknowledgement. Like it understood that the drone was leaving and was permitting that departure. The flight back to camp took 18 minutes. The operator spent that time trying to process what they'd just witnessed, trying to categorize it within some framework that made sense. Bears standing upright would be the obvious explanation, except bears don't stand that long, don't move that smoothly on 2 legs, don't coordinate tactical responses to aerial surveillance. Bears don't organize into groups with obvious hierarchies and teaching behaviors. Bears don't craft tools or make carrying pouches. These weren't bears. The operator knew that with absolute certainty. The drone landed safely at base camp. The operator downloaded all the footage to 3 separate hard drives, paranoid about losing this data. The raw files showed everything clearly. Multiple creatures, clearly visible, clearly bipedal, clearly demonstrating intelligence and coordination. This was documentation of something unknown, something that shouldn't exist according to conventional wildlife science. The operator sat in their truck for an hour, just watching the footage loop on the laptop screen, watching these things move through that clearing with purpose and awareness, watching them demonstrate tool use and social organization that implied cognition well beyond any known North American mammal. That night, the operator stayed in their truck instead of the tent, kept the doors locked, kept the interior light on. The rational part of their brain said this was unnecessary paranoia. The creatures were 12 miles away. Even if they wanted to approach base camp, which there was no indication they did, 12 miles of dense forest would take hours to traverse. But the irrational part, the part that had seen those things coordinate a response to the drone, the part that had watched them throw rocks 400 feet into the air, that part insisted on the locked truck and the light. Sleep was difficult. Every sound outside the truck made the operator's eyes snap open. Wind moving through trees sounded like footsteps. Branches breaking sounded like something large moving through undergrowth. Around 3 a.m, there was a sound that definitely wasn't wind or falling branches. Heavy breathing, very close to the truck. The operator sat up, looked out the windows into darkness. The headlights were off to save battery, only the small interior dome light providing any illumination. Outside was complete blackness. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence returned. The operator stayed awake until sunrise. Morning revealed nothing unusual around the truck. No tracks in the dirt, no sign anything had been near the vehicle during the night. The operator walked the perimeter of the clear-cut, looking for evidence of visitors. Found nothing conclusive. Just normal forest debris, normal animal signs. Deer tracks, bird droppings, the usual scatter of pine cones and needles. Nothing to explain the breathing sounds from the night before. Easy to dismiss as imagination, as stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Except the operator knew what they'd heard. Knew something had been close to that truck. The decision to continue the survey versus pack up and leave took about 30 minutes of internal debate. The contract required complete coverage of the survey area. Leaving early would mean breaking that contract, potentially not getting paid, definitely damaging professional reputation. But staying meant more flights over territory that contained things that clearly didn't want to be observed. Things that had demonstrated both awareness of the drone and the capability to respond to it. The operator decided to compromise. Continue the survey, but avoid the area where yesterday's encounter occurred. The grid pattern could be completed without flying over that specific clearing again. Day 5 proceeded without incident. The operator modified the flight plan to exclude a 2-mile radius around yesterday's clearing. The drone covered the planned area, captured the required imagery, returned safely each time. No unusual sightings, no encounters. Just standard forest survey work. The operator began to relax slightly. Maybe yesterday's encounter was an isolated incident. Maybe those creatures only inhabited that one specific area and wouldn't be a factor in the remaining survey work. That night was quiet. No mysterious breathing, no unexplained sounds. The operator managed a few hours of actual sleep in the truck. Morning of day 6 brought low cloud cover and light rain. Not ideal for aerial photography, but workable. The operator launched the drone on a modified schedule, taking advantage of breaks in the weather to complete sections of the grid. The rain created interesting visual texture in the footage. Water droplets on leaves catching the light, streams showing higher flow rates than previous days. The second encounter happened mid-afternoon. The drone was working through a section of older forest, areas that hadn't been logged in decades. The canopy was thick enough that very little undergrowth survived beneath it, creating open spaces between the massive tree trunks. A camera picked up movement in one of these spaces. Multiple figures walking through the forest in a loose formation. The operator's stomach dropped when they recognized what they were seeing. The creatures. Not in their clearing, but traveling. moving through the forest with obvious purpose and direction. The operator counted at least 8 distinct figures in the group, possibly more, partially obscured by trees. They were traveling in a specific direction, maintaining consistent spacing between individuals, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a group that travels together regularly. This was migration or patrol or hunting behavior. This was routine movement through territory they clearly knew well. The drone's camera tracked them for about 3 minutes before the canopy became too thick to maintain visual contact. The operator checked the GPS coordinates of this sighting against yesterday's clearing location, 5 miles apart. These creatures had range. They moved through extensive territory, weren't confined to a single location. The survey area was 40 square miles, and the operator had now documented these things in 2 separate areas 5 miles apart. That suggested a territory of at least that size, probably larger. It suggested a population bigger than the 10 individuals seen yesterday. A viable population would need dozens at minimum, probably more to maintain genetic diversity. The implications were staggering. A breeding population of unknown large primates living in a national forest. Creatures intelligent enough to use tools, to coordinate responses, to organize into social groups with clear hierarchies. Creatures that had somehow avoided definitive documentation despite existing in territory that saw recreational use from hikers and hunters. The operator knew what this footage meant. This was evidence that would rewrite biology textbooks. This was proof of something that mainstream science said couldn't exist. But it was also evidence that would bring unwanted attention to these creatures. The operator understood that releasing this footage would result in an immediate influx of people into this forest. Researchers, hunters, curiosity seekers, media crews. The creatures' habitat would be invaded, their privacy destroyed, their survival potentially threatened. The operator grappled with this ethical dilemma for the rest of the day. The responsibility of possessing proof versus the responsibility of protecting what had been discovered. That evening, the operator reviewed all the footage carefully. Frame-by-frame examination of the clearing encounter revealed details that weren't visible during the live observation. The tools several creatures carried showed deliberate craftsmanship. Stone implements with edges worked to specific angles for cutting or scraping. Wooden staffs with carved grips positioned for comfortable handling. The woven pouch had a geometric pattern in its construction that implied aesthetic sense beyond pure function. These creatures didn't just use tools. They refined them, decorated them, showed pride in their creation. The social dynamics visible in the footage were equally revealing. The juveniles stayed close to specific adults, probably their mothers or caregivers. The large central figure commanded attention when it gestured or vocalized, the others responding immediately to its direction. But there were also moments of what looked like disagreement. 2 of the creatures engaged in what appeared to be an argument, animated gestures and vocalizations back and forth, before one of them deferred to the other. Social hierarchy with room for discussion. Authority that could be challenged or questioned. This was sophisticated social organization. Day 7, the final day of the survey, brought clear weather and a decision. The operator would complete the contract, would deliver the standard topographic mapping data to the client, but would not include the footage of the creatures. Those files would be separated out, stored separately, not mentioned in the official survey report. This wasn't fraud exactly. The contract was for mapping data, and the mapping data would be complete and accurate. The creature footage was incidental, unrelated to the contract's scope of work. The final day's flights were completed without incident. The operator packed up base camp methodically, making sure no equipment or trash was left behind. The drive out took 3 hours, navigating the barely maintained logging roads carefully. Back to paved roads, back to cell phone service, back to the normal world, where creatures like the ones in the footage didn't exist. The operator delivered the contracted mapping data on time. The client was satisfied with the work. Nobody asked if anything unusual had been observed during the survey. The footage sat on those hard drives for 3 months before the operator showed it to anyone. The first person to see it was a friend who worked in wildlife biology. The operator trusted this person's scientific expertise and their discretion. They watched the footage together in silence. When it finished, the biologist's first words were asking if this was some kind of elaborate hoax. The operator assured them it wasn't. Every frame was original, unedited footage from the drone's camera. The metadata embedded in the files showed continuous recording, no breaks or edits that would indicate manipulation. The biologist watched it 3 more times, pausing frequently to examine details. The biologist's analysis was disturbing. The creature's locomotion was wrong for any known North American mammal. The body proportions didn't match bears, didn't match great apes, didn't match anything in the literature. The coordinated behavior suggested advanced social organization beyond what's seen in known primates except humans. The tool use, the apparent communication, the tactical response to the drone, all of it pointed toward intelligence that shouldn't exist in something that looked like this. The biologist had no explanation that fit conventional wildlife science. Every attempt to categorize these creatures within known taxonomy failed. They were something else, something unknown. The biologist made calls, carefully worded inquiries to colleagues who specialized in cryptozoology and anomalous wildlife reports. Always vague, never mentioning the footage directly, just feeling out whether there was existing knowledge about things like this. The responses were consistent. Several biologists admitted off-record that there were persistent reports of creatures matching this description from wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. Reports going back decades, maybe centuries if you included indigenous accounts. Stories from tribal elders about beings that walked like men but looked like wolves, that lived in the deepest forests and avoided human contact. Accounts from early European explorers mentioning strange sightings that didn't match known animals. But there was more. A pattern in how these reports were handled. Park services and forest management agencies had procedures for dealing with them. Not official procedures that appeared in any manual, but understood protocols passed down informally. Reports were taken seriously, documented carefully, then classified and buried. People who submitted particularly credible reports were sometimes visited by federal agents who encouraged them strongly to reconsider sharing their experiences publicly. There was an active effort to suppress information about these creatures, an institutional conspiracy of silence that had been maintained for generations. The biologist's contacts included one person who'd worked for the Forest Service for 30 years before retiring. This person, speaking only on condition of complete anonymity, revealed that field personnel were briefed on these creatures during training. Not in classroom settings, not in written materials, but in quiet conversations between experienced rangers and newcomers. They were told what to do if they encountered one, how to avoid confrontation, how to retreat safely, how to document without creating public panic. They were told that reports would be filed, but would not be investigated publicly. That protecting these creatures meant protecting them through obscurity. The retired ranger explained the reasoning. These creatures, whatever they were, appeared to be a relict population, survivors of something that should have gone extinct, but had somehow persisted in remote wilderness areas. They actively avoided humans, had learned over generations that human contact was dangerous. Their continued survival depended on remaining hidden, on maintaining the myth that they didn't exist. Federal agencies had made the decision, probably decades ago, that protecting these creatures meant keeping them secret, meant suppressing evidence, discrediting witnesses, maintaining official denial. It was conservation through denial, protection through obscurity. The operator understood then that releasing the footage would accomplish nothing except destroying the lives of these creatures. The footage was clear, undeniable, but that would only make things worse. It would trigger a response from both official agencies trying to contain the situation and from private interests trying to exploit it. Hunters would want trophies. Researchers would want specimens. Entertainment companies would want to film them. The forest would be invaded by thousands of people trying to find these things. The creatures wouldn't survive that kind of attention. Their habitat would be destroyed, their population scattered or killed, their way of life ended. 6 months after the survey, the operator was contacted by someone who identified themselves only as a federal wildlife official. The conversation was brief. The official knew about the survey, knew approximately when and where it had occurred, and wanted to know if anything unusual had been documented. The operator lied, said the survey had been routine, nothing out of the ordinary captured on camera. The official seemed satisfied with this response, but mentioned that if any unusual footage did exist, it would be in everyone's best interest, including the operators, if that footage remained private. The implication was clear. There would be consequences for making this public. The operator has since learned that this wasn't an isolated contact. Other people who've captured similar evidence have received similar visits. Always polite, always vague about which agency they represent, always making it clear that keeping quiet is the preferred option. Sometimes there are carrots offered. Consulting contracts for future work, permits approved that might otherwise be denied, introductions to lucrative contacts. Sometimes there are sticks, permits mysteriously rejected, contracts canceled, equipment inspections that find violations requiring expensive corrections. The message is consistent. Keep this quiet and prosper. Make it public and suffer. The operator still has the hard drives. 3 copies of the complete footage stored in separate locations. Sometimes late at night, they pull up the files and watch them again. Watch those creatures in their clearing. Watch them coordinate their response to an unexpected visitor in their sky. Watch them demonstrate intelligence and social organization. The footage is remarkable. It's proof of something that would change our understanding of what lives in North American wilderness. But it's also a burden. The responsibility of possessing knowledge that can't be shared without causing harm. Other drone operators have had similar experiences. The operator has learned this through careful networking, through conversations at industry conferences, through the kind of quiet communication that happens between people who share strange knowledge. There's an informal network of aerial survey operators who've captured footage of things they can't explain. Creatures in remote areas, behaving in ways that don't match known wildlife. They share this knowledge carefully, never publicly, always with the understanding that what they've documented needs to remain undocumented officially. The pattern that emerges from these shared experiences is consistent. The creatures appear to inhabit specific types of terrain. Old-growth forest in mountainous regions, areas with limited human access and complex topography that provides natural shelter and privacy. They avoid roads, avoid established trails, avoid any area with regular human presence. They've learned over generations where the boundaries are between their world and ours. They police those boundaries carefully, approaching them only when necessary, retreating when humans get too close. They travel at night more than during day, which is why daytime aerial surveys capture them so rarely. Most of the footage exists because drones happen to be in the right place at the right time, captured images during the brief windows when these creatures are active in daylight. The operator's footage is unusual because it was captured during afternoon hours, caught the creatures in the middle of some kind of gathering or teaching session that required daylight activity. Most sightings are fleeting, partial, showing just enough to raise questions without providing answers. But the operator's footage is different. It's extended observation, multiple angles, clear documentation of group behavior and intelligence. It shows not just that these things exist, but what they are. Thinking beings with social structures and learned behaviors. Beings with material culture and technological adaptation. Beings that deserve protection precisely because they're more than animals. Beings that have somehow maintained their secrecy despite the steady encroachment of human activity into wilderness areas. Their survival is evidence of intelligence and adaptation, of careful avoidance of contact maintained across generations. The operator thinks about that clearing sometimes, wonders if the creatures still use it, if they've abandoned it after the drone encounter, if they've modified their behavior to account for the possibility of aerial surveillance. Wonders if they think about that day, if they discuss among themselves what that flying machine was, if they've developed strategies for dealing with future encounters. The intelligence demonstrated in the footage suggests they're capable of that kind of adaptation, that kind of learning from experience. They threw rocks at the drone. Next time, they might have better strategies. They're learning about us even as we try to learn about them. The ethical weight of possessing this footage never gets lighter. The operator knows what it shows, knows what it could prove, knows that releasing it would answer questions that have persisted for generations. But the operator also knows what would happen to those creatures if their existence was confirmed, knows that their best protection is continued doubt, continued skepticism about whether they're real, knows that keeping this footage hidden is an act of protection, even if it means living with the frustration of possessing proof that can never be shared. Other people have footage too. The operator has seen some of it, shared through that informal network of people who've captured something they weren't supposed to see. Game camera images showing figures too tall to be human. Trail cameras triggered by something moving on two legs through areas where no people should be. Thermal imaging from Forest Service drones showing heat signatures that don't match any known wildlife. All of it carefully guarded, carefully hidden, kept out of public view to protect both the creatures and the people who documented them. Because releasing footage like this carries consequences. The operator knows of at least 2 people who tried to make their evidence public and regretted it. Their professional reputations were destroyed. They were accused of fraud, of creating hoaxes for attention or money. Even when their footage was analyzed and found to be authentic, the public response was to assume sophisticated fakery rather than accept what the images showed. The truth is too far outside normal experience for most people to accept, even when it's documented clearly. And beyond the personal consequences, there were other pressures. Visits from people suggesting it would be better to recant their claims. Equipment mysteriously malfunctioning or disappearing. Contracts being canceled. Permits being denied for future work. The message was clear. Some things are better left undocumented. Some truths are better left unspoken. The machinery of official denial runs deep and has substantial resources to deploy against people who threaten to expose what's being protected. The operator has made peace with keeping this footage private, has accepted that possessing this evidence means bearing the responsibility of protecting what it documents. The creatures in that forest, whatever they are, have managed to survive by remaining hidden, by being dismissed as myth, as misidentification, as the products of overactive imagination. That dismissal is their armor against extinction. Confirming their existence would strip away that protection and leave them vulnerable to every person who wanted to prove they exist, study them, hunt them, or simply see them. So the footage stays on hard drives in a basement, gets backed up regularly, gets copied to new storage as old drives age, but never gets uploaded to any network, never gets shown to anyone outside that small circle of people who already know and already understand what needs to be protected. The operator continues doing aerial survey work, continues flying drones over forests and fields and mountains, always watching the footage feed carefully now, always aware that the wilderness below contains more mystery than most people imagine. Sometimes during surveys the operator sees things that might be them, thermal signatures that are almost right, but not quite, movement patterns in dense forest that suggest something large traveling on 2 legs, disturbances in areas where there shouldn't be disturbances. These moments bring back memories of that first encounter, of watching those creatures coordinate their response to an aerial visitor, of seeing them demonstrate intelligence and social organization. The operator never gets closer to investigate, never tries to document these possible sightings more thoroughly. One clear footage of definitive proof is enough. More would just add to the burden of knowledge that can't be shared. The creatures themselves are probably aware of drones by now. In the years since that first encounter, aerial survey work has only increased in these forests. Environmental monitoring, fire mapping, conservation assessment, all of it using drone technology more extensively than ever before. If these creatures are as intelligent as the footage suggests, they've learned to recognize drones, learned to avoid being visible when they hear the characteristic whine of electric motors in their sky. They've adapted as they've adapted to every other change humans have brought to their territory. Which raises questions about how long they've been adapting. How many generations have passed information about avoiding humans, about the signs that indicate human presence, about the tools and technologies that represent threats? The coordination seen in the footage suggests social learning, cultural transmission of knowledge. These aren't creatures operating solely on instinct. They're beings who teach their young, who pass down accumulated wisdom, who modify their behavior based on changes in their environment. They're beings with culture, with history, with stories they probably tell about the world they inhabit. The operator wonders sometimes what those stories might contain. What do these creatures think about humans? Do they have legends about us, the way we have legends about them? Do they understand that we're the dominant species on this continent, that we've transformed the landscape in ways that have driven countless other species to extinction or near extinction? Do they understand that their survival depends on our ignorance, on our collective willingness to dismiss their existence as impossible? Or do they simply see us as another threat to be avoided, another predator to be careful around, another challenge in the daily struggle to survive? The footage captured that day represents a moment of genuine contact between species. Not planned contact, not managed by researchers or documented by scientists, but accidental intersection of worlds that normally remain separate. The creatures in that clearing weren't expecting to be observed from above. Their response shows surprise, then assessment, and coordinated reaction. They evaluated the threat level of the drone, determined how to respond, executed that response with precision. Then, when the drone climbed out of range, they returned to their activities. The interaction was brief, but it demonstrated something profound about their capabilities. That capacity for assessment and response suggests minds, working at levels we don't usually attribute to non-human creatures. These aren't animals acting on programmed instinct. These are beings making decisions, solving problems, coordinating actions with other members of their group. The footage shows them doing this in real time, adapting to an unexpected situation they'd probably never encountered before. A drone in their sky was a novel challenge, and they met it with novel solutions. That's intelligence. That's consciousness. That's proof that we're not alone in possessing those qualities. The operator carries this knowledge daily, carries the understanding that the forests contain minds that think, beings that reason, creatures that deserve consideration as something more than wildlife to be managed or resources to be protected. They deserve recognition as fellow inhabitants of this continent, as survivors who've managed to maintain their existence in the margins of a world increasingly dominated by human activity. They deserve the protection that comes from continued obscurity, from people like the operator making the choice to keep evidence hidden rather than risk exposing them to harm. The hard drives will eventually fail. Digital storage degrades over time, and even with regular backups and migration to newer media, there's a finite lifespan to electronic data storage. The operator knows this, has thought about what it means for the long-term preservation of this evidence, whether keeping it digital is the right choice, whether there should be physical copies, whether the footage should be distributed more widely among that network of people who understand its significance. These are questions without easy answers. Too much distribution increases the risk of leaks. Too little distribution risks losing the evidence entirely if something happens to the operator or the current storage. But for now, the footage exists as proof that something unknown lives in our forests, exists as documentation of intelligence and social organization in a species we don't officially recognize. exists as a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries, still contains creatures that have avoided our attempts to catalog and understand everything that lives on this planet. The footage is both evidence and burden, both proof and problem, both answer and question. And it sits on those hard drives in someone's basement, where nobody's supposed to see it, where it will probably remain for as long as those creatures need the protection that secrecy provides. The operator has accepted this role as guardian of evidence that can't be revealed, has made peace with possessing proof that must remain private, has committed to protecting these creatures through silence, through keeping their existence uncertain, through maintaining the doubt that serves as their best defense against a world that would destroy them, through the simple act of confirming they're real. This is the choice made by someone who saw something they weren't supposed to see and understood that seeing isn't always the same as sharing. Sometimes the most responsible thing to do with truth is to protect it from people who aren't ready to handle its implications. And maybe someday things will change. Maybe there will come a time when these creatures can be acknowledged without being threatened, when proof of their existence won't trigger an invasion of their habitat, when humans have evolved enough in our relationship with nature that we can share the world with beings like this without destroying them. But that time isn't now. Right now, the best protection these creatures have is continued uncertainty about whether they exist. Right now, the footage needs to stay hidden. Right now, the operator carries the weight of knowledge that can't be spoken, proof that can't be shared, evidence that exists in a basement on hard drives that nobody's supposed to see. And that's how it needs to stay. The months after that survey changed how the operator approached wilderness work. Every forest became a place of potential discovery. Every clearing visible from the air became a space where something unknown might exist. The work itself remained the same. Launch drones, capture imagery, deliver data to clients. But the awareness underneath that work was different now. The understanding that beneath those endless tree canopies, there might be communities of beings living lives we know nothing about. Beings who've mastered the art of invisibility in a world where satellites map every square meter of Earth's surface. That mastery of concealment is itself impressive. The operator has thought about this extensively. How does a breeding population of large primates avoid detection in the era of GPS tracking, thermal imaging, and ubiquitous cameras? The answer visible in the footage is intelligence applied to survival. These creatures know where cameras are likely to be. They know which areas get human traffic and which don't. They time their movements to avoid exposure. They teach their young the rules of invisibility from early age. The juvenile in the footage staying close to adults wasn't just being protective. It was learning. Being taught how to survive in a world where being seen means being endangered. The operator has noticed patterns in the thermal imaging data from various surveys. Anomalous heat signatures that appear briefly, then disappear. Always in remote areas, always in terrain that's difficult to access. The signatures are large, roughly human-sized or bigger, but the movement patterns are wrong for people. Too fast through dense undergrowth, too comfortable in terrain that would slow humans considerably. When the operator compares notes with others in that informal network, the patterns become clearer. These thermal hits cluster in specific regions, specific habitat types. The creatures have preferred territories, established ranges they move through regularly. Some of those territories overlap with areas that indigenous communities have always said were sacred or forbidden. Places where tribal elders warn younger members not to go, not because of physical danger, but because of something else. Something that lives there and should be left undisturbed. The operator has started reading old ethnographic accounts, looking for patterns in traditional knowledge that might explain what the footage shows. The correlation is striking. Many indigenous accounts describe beings that match what the drone captured. Tall, fur-covered, walking on two legs, intelligent, but not human. The descriptions are too consistent, too specific, to dismiss as pure mythology. Those traditional accounts also include something else: constructions for coexistence. Rules about respecting these beings' territory, about not disturbing their sacred places, about maintaining proper distance and deference. The accounts treat these creatures not as animals to be hunted or feared, but as neighbors to be respected. Other people, different people, but people nonetheless. The footage validates that traditional wisdom, shows that indigenous communities weren't creating myths. They were describing reality. They were maintaining accurate knowledge about what lived in their territories and passing it down through generations. The operator has considered reaching out to indigenous elders, sharing the footage with people whose ancestors might have known these creatures. But that presents its own ethical complications. Even sharing evidence with people who already know these beings exist could create problems. It could pressure those communities to share their knowledge more publicly. It could expose them to the same scrutiny and skepticism that would follow any public revelation. The operator has decided that silence protects everyone. The creatures, yes, but also the communities who've lived alongside them for centuries without needing Western science to validate their experiences. The scientific establishment's response to this evidence, if it were released, is predictable. Initial skepticism followed by demands for more proof. Physical specimens, DNA samples, skeletal remains. Anything less than a body would be dismissed as inconclusive. And obtaining that kind of proof would require exactly the kind of invasive contact that would destroy these creatures' ability to remain hidden. The footage shows intelligent beings capable of avoiding humans when they choose. Proving their existence to scientific satisfaction would require hunting them, capturing them, or killing them. The cost of proof would be paid by the creatures themselves. This creates an impossible situation. The evidence exists, but can't be shared. The proof is clear, but must remain hidden. The scientific questions are answerable, but won't be answered. The operator lives in this paradox daily, knows the truth, but participates in the collective fiction that these creatures don't exist. It's a strange form of cognitive dissonance. Standing at industry conferences listening to discussions about wildlife management and conservation, knowing that the most remarkable wildlife discovery in modern history is locked on hard drives at home, unable to contribute that knowledge, unable to share what would revolutionize entire fields of study. Sometimes the operator imagines what would happen if they did release the footage. The initial explosion of attention, the media frenzy, the immediate deployment of research teams into that forest. The invasion would be total and immediate. Every person with a camera would want to capture these creatures. Every scientist would want to study them. Every hunter would want to prove they're the one who confirmed their existence. The forest would become a circus. The creatures would be driven from their territories, their society disrupted, their survival threatened. All in the name of scientific discovery and public knowledge. The operator has seen this pattern before in wildlife conservation. A new species discovered, initial excitement and study, then exploitation and decline. The difference here is that these creatures are intelligent enough to understand what's happening to them, smart enough to know when their world is being invaded, when their privacy is being violated, when their survival is being threatened. They would understand that human contact means danger. They would fight back or flee. Either response would end badly for them. Fighting would get them killed. Fleeing would compress their population into smaller areas with insufficient resources. The outcome would be the same either way. So the footage stays hidden, and the operator lives with the weight of that choice. Lives with knowing that future generations might condemn this decision, might argue that scientific knowledge should never be suppressed, that hiding evidence is a betrayal of human curiosity and understanding. But the operator has seen these creatures through the camera, has watched them interact with their young, coordinate responses to threats, demonstrate intelligence and emotion, has seen enough to know they're not just a scientific curiosity. They're beings with their own lives, their own societies, their own right to exist, without being studied or displayed or proven. The operator wonders what the creatures learned from that encounter, whether they understood what the drone was, whether they've modified their behavior in response to knowing that flying machines can observe them from above. Whether they've developed new strategies for remaining hidden from aerial surveillance. The intelligence visible in the footage suggests they're capable of that kind of adaptive learning, capable of analyzing threats and developing countermeasures, capable of passing those lessons to the next generation so their children grow up knowing how to avoid detection from above as well as from ground level. This is evolution happening in real time. Not biological evolution, but cultural evolution. These creatures adapting their behavior to deal with new threats, new technologies, new ways that humans can intrude into their territory. They've been doing this for probably centuries, learning to avoid roads as roads spread through wilderness, learning to recognize the sound of vehicles and firearms, learning to distinguish between hikers who pose minimal threat and hunters who pose maximum threat, now learning to recognize drones and developing strategies to avoid or counter them. Each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge of survival in a human-dominated world. The operator has started documenting areas where these thermal anomalies and movement patterns appear most frequently, not to create a map for finding them, but to understand their territory better, to identify areas that might need special protection from human activity. The data shows clear patterns. The creatures prefer old-growth forest with complex understory. They use terrain with multiple escape routes and good visibility of approaches. They avoid areas near roads and trails, but will cross them when necessary, typically at night. They stay in regions with reliable water sources and diverse food availability. Their habitat selection is sophisticated and purposeful. These habitat preferences overlap significantly with areas that conservation groups are fighting to protect from logging and development. The operator has wondered whether to share this information with conservation organizations, whether evidence of a unique population might help protect these forests. But that path leads to the same problem. Any proof of these creatures would trigger investigation and intrusion. Better to let the forests be protected for conventional reasons. Spotted owl habitat, salmon spawning grounds, watershed protection. The creatures benefit from conservation efforts aimed at other species, remaining hidden beneficiaries of environmental protection. The operator has become more sensitive to wilderness preservation debates, understands now that protecting forests means protecting more than we officially acknowledge. Every acre of old growth saved from logging might be preserving habitat for beings we don't admit exist. Every road opposed might be maintaining corridors these creatures need for safe movement through their territory. The battles over wilderness protection take on different meaning when you know what's actually being protected. When you understand that conservation isn't just about preserving abstract ecosystems, but about protecting specific communities of intelligent beings. Sometimes the operator gets emails from people asking about unusual sightings during surveys. Other operators who've seen something strange and are trying to figure out what it was. The operator responds carefully, never admitting possession of definitive evidence, but encouraging these people to trust what they saw, validating their experiences without pushing them to go public, helping them understand that some knowledge should be protected rather than shared, building that informal network of people who know but don't speak, who understand but don't reveal, who protect through silence rather than expose through disclosure. That network has grown slowly over the years since the encounter, not through organized recruitment, but through natural connection between people who've had similar experiences. People who've seen things they can't explain using conventional wildlife knowledge. People who've captured footage or images that show something that shouldn't exist. People who've realized that some discoveries are too dangerous to announce. They find each other carefully, share their evidence privately, support each other in bearing the burden of secret knowledge. It's a community bound by shared understanding of what needs to be protected. The operator has learned from this community that the phenomena isn't limited to the Pacific Northwest. Similar creatures appear in footage and reports from wilderness areas across North America, the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians, the boreal forests of Canada. The descriptions vary slightly by region, but the core characteristics remain consistent. Large bipedal primates, intelligent behavior, active avoidance of humans, social organization. The distribution suggests these aren't remnants of a single isolated population, but survivors of something that once ranged across the continent. Multiple populations maintaining their own territories, possibly with limited contact between groups. This broader distribution makes their survival more plausible. A single isolated population would face genetic bottleneck problems, inbreeding depression, vulnerability to local disasters. But multiple populations across vast geography have better survival prospects. They can maintain genetic diversity, recover from localized population crashes, adapt to regional conditions. The continental distribution also explains why sightings are reported from so many different areas. These aren't a single group of creatures, but a species that has learned to survive in the margins of human civilization across thousands of miles of wilderness. The operator's footage shows one small group in one location at one moment in time, but it's a window into something much larger. A glimpse of a hidden world that exists parallel to ours, sharing the same forests and mountains, but remaining carefully separate. A world of beings who've mastered the art of living alongside humans without being detected. Beings who understand that their survival depends on our ignorance, who've learned through hard experience that human contact brings only danger and disruption. The footage is proof that this world exists. But sharing that proof would destroy what it documents. And so the operator keeps the files secure and the knowledge private, continues flying drones over wilderness areas, continues capturing imagery for clients, continues participating in the public fiction that these creatures don't exist. The cognitive dissonance never fully resolves. The tension between possessing proof and maintaining silence never disappears. But the choice seems clearer now than it did immediately after the encounter. Protecting these beings means protecting them from confirmation. Keeping them safe means keeping them secret. Ensuring their survival means participating in the collective denial of their existence. It's a strange form of conservation, but it's the only form that works for creatures intelligent enough to understand that being discovered means being destroyed.